Hello and welcome to another World Values Day live conversation. I'm Anna McAfee and I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Griffiths to this chat. Andrew is a Director of Policy and Partnerships at Planet Mark, and as a friend I can say he's an all-round just great human being and very much involved in so many things in the sustainability space. So I'm excited to talk to you, Andrew, about sustainability.
Yeah, lovely to be here, and lovely to have a chance to catch up. It's been far too long, Anna. Far too long.
It has. Now, I've part of these conversations has had me asking people to pick a value and tell me where it came from and how they put it into practice. But given that we are talking about sustainability, I want to ask you specifically about that as a value. How it developed for you, like where it became such a driver for you in your life, and perhaps how you put it into practice.
It's an interesting question. So I'd say that sustainability, in terms of particularly career-wise, was an itch that I hadn't been scratching enough to satiate me for probably about 5 or 6 years prior to me actually making the transition into working in sustainability full time. But I was sort of always that person within a company who was, let's get some new recycling bins. I was, trying to find ways that we could be more environmentally friendly, more socially friendly, and otherwise, and sort of getting companies that I worked with recycling more and doing different things. So it was sort of always, it was there, and it was something that I was interested in, and I was just proactively kind of leaning into doing within whatever role I was in, but I just wasn't scratching it enough. And so I started very proactively looking into it more. I went and took a course with CISL, sort of a Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which is sort of an online remote course, which is fantastic. And I just very proactively started networking within the space, so through events and through connections and through people through LinkedIn and all those different areas. And that, I was in the orbit of Planet Mark for about 2 years prior to actually joining, where myself and the CEO, Steve, would sort of meet up every few months for a coffee and a catch up. And, and I was just giving him ideas and sharing thoughts on digitization and how to build a community at Planet Mark and different things like that. And then, he reached out to me. It was just when the pandemic had begun. Reached out to me on a Sunday, texted me saying, you free to have a quick chat? And I just called him straight back, like, no time like the present, what do you want? And he's like, I think we need your skill set. Would you like to come on board? And I just went, yes. And he went, do you want to think about it? I was like, no. That was about 3.5 years ago now. Nearly. So haven't looked back since. So that's kind of how sort of my sort of progression into sustainability came about. In terms of how I put it into practice in my daily life, I sort of live and breathe it to a large degree. In that's what I do for work and all that sort of stuff. But where I've chosen to live, where I am now, is sort of on its own. It's a whole estate just to the south of London that's on its own biomass heating system, and we generate most of our own energy and lots of things like that. So I sort of live in a really lovely sort of eco community, but trying to do swap outs whenever I'm coming to sort of need to replace something that I've had for a while, whether like a toothbrush or toothpaste. Then gradually over time I would go, right, I need a new toothbrush. Right, what's my new and then I do research at that point. So I wasn't trying to do everything all at once. It was more as and when it came up in my life that I needed to refresh and, get a new washing detergent, get a new, deodorant, whatever it might be. I would do the research at that point in time. So it was never sort of overwhelming in being like, right, I need to be sustainable in all the different ways right now. I sort of, when I'd finish using something up, I would then replace. sort of how I did it.
I think that's a really valid point. I think there's so much in the sustainability space about get rid of all your non-sustainable things and go and buy all these sustainable products. And in actual fact, that's about the last thing you should do.
Use up what you've got, and it just makes it a bit more manageable. It's like, oh, okay, I need deodorant now. Okay, I'll sit down and just research what's the best ways I could sort of reduce my plastic waste or something like that from using those sorts of things. And then over time, you gradually, and they'll talk to people as well. So, when you're doing that research, part of it might be, doing a bit of Googling and whatever, or Ecosia is a great search engine. Part of it is just asking sort of other people within sort of the networking community, going, has anyone found a deodorant that they really like and they use well? So I use Wild because it's got changeable cartridges that are sort of fully biodegradable and everything, so you don't end up with plastic waste when you use it, which is nice.
And something else I wanted to ask you on that, because I do remember seeing this, I think on LinkedIn about a year ago, was in terms of travel. And I thought it was a really interesting post about you were weighing up. I think you were heading off somewhere into Europe for possibly a wedding, I think. And it was the flying versus train and actually how you make those decisions.
Yeah.
And I think you went train one way and flew the other way because you were weighing up a lot of other factors in life.
Yeah. No, that was it. Yeah, that was an interesting one. So I went basically within both professional and personal life. I'd kind of try and operate on a travel hierarchy. It's what the formal way of referring to it. But essentially, all that you're saying is, I have an order of preference of modes of transport that I would like to use, and I will do my utmost to figure out, is there any reasonable way that I can do those ones? So can I walk there? No, I can't walk to Prague. So can't walk there. Okay. Can I, could I just drive there in an electric car? Probably not. I've got a little to do. Can I get there on public transport? Is really what should come second there. Or can I cycle? Is another good one. But again, not to Prague. Can I take public transport? And the answer to that question is yes. I can. Then I will try and do that. But like we had a situation last year where COP27 was in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. We really looked. Can we get me there on trains and boats and stuff? And we realized that the length of time it would take and some of the countries we'd have to navigate around that have war and political instability would have been such that, I'd have been out of action. Well, not out of action, but I'd have been traveling for, 1.5 to 2 months each way. And then when you start racking up hotels and, all of those sorts of things into the mix, it ceases to make sense after a certain amount of time. So we made the tough decision to fly. But that's one end of the equation where we look at, what are the options? And then the second question always has to be, well, do we really need to go? Because it's like, is there a lower carbon alternative available? If there is, great. If there's not, okay, what are we doing? But you always still have to ask the question, do you really need to go? And like, what's the impact of you going? And so, flying to Sharm el Sheikh would have been about 0.5 ton of CO2. And so we looked at it on impact in two different ways. The first was, the average Planet Mark member company. We work with over 700 organizations who commit to reducing their emissions every single year. And then the average one of our members reduces by more than 200 tons of CO2 per year. And so if I can get one new organization to be on that journey with us, then in principle, 0.5 ton is a good investment. But the second piece of the impact for COP27 specifically is because COP27 is very, very focused on policy. It's very focused on sort of international agreements and sort of standards. And so we've been very heavily involved in things like the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which is the International Standards Organization sort of framework that's being developed to sort of wrap around what net zero means for businesses. And if we can, having been very involved in developing it and also now implementing it and rolling it out, we knew that if we can nudge that even a tiny bit toward, a higher level of best practice or toward being implemented and taken up by more organizations, then the impact is sort of almost incalculable in terms of how much of that nudge has an impact. So we sort of do an impact assessment in terms of whether we should travel or not. And the instance you were talking about in terms of coming back from Prague, I traveled there via trains, it took a long time. It was sort of overnights. It was sort of about a day and a half of travel, because I'd sort of travel overnight various places, and I made it work. I broke it up by having a day annual leave in the middle in Berlin with a friend, which was great. But then coming back, I had a friend's stag do that I had to get to, and I was either going to essentially miss the stag do because of a work commitment, but it would have been a work commitment where I would have been traveling back for a really long time. And so I made the personal decision that I wanted to make sure I could get back for that. And it's hard. It's tough sort of thing. But I am also a big believer that there has been slightly too much emphasis in some ways placed on the personal carbon footprint in a lot of marketing, and that the concept of a carbon footprint was actually created by BP. The concept of the personal, it was an oil and gas company invented the concept of a personal carbon footprint. Now, why did they do that? Oh, because it's your fault. It's your demand. We're just supplying. It's like a drug dealer being like, I'm just supplying you with what you want. It's your demand for my drugs that and it's just the reality is that something crazy like 80% of global emissions have been emitted by less than 100 companies worldwide. And so, I take it I think it's important for us to live in line with our values as much as is humanly possible, but without trying to sort of create a stick to beat ourselves with, because ultimately the change that needs to happen is bigger than individual personal footprints. That's sort of my reflections.
That's interesting. Yeah, it is really interesting. Sort of looking at businesses, and you mentioned the corporate impact and the impact that businesses are, I guess, having on the environment, and the fact that BP has nicely invented the measure for us to all consider. What would be your advice to businesses who are looking to integrate sustainability into their processes or into their supply chain, or just to really, I guess, shift their focus into more sustainable practices?
So I'd generally say I've sort of three little taglines that I use regularly when I talk about this, which is that, and you can apply this to anything as well. So you can apply this to carbon, you can apply this to social value creation, but you can also apply this to money, and budgets and financial targets and forecasts. And the very simple truth is, number one, you can't manage what you don't measure. It's very hard to make progress on something if you don't know where you're coming from. Number two is you can't progress towards something you haven't set a target for. You've got to have a line of sight and the direction of travel to sort of know if you're going in the right direction or not. And then the third is, if you haven't got a plan, it probably isn't going to happen. That certain amount can happen serendipitously, but probably not, a robust sustainability strategy, I think it's fair to say. And so, you can't manage what you don't measure. You can't progress towards something you haven't set a target for. And if you haven't got a plan, it probably ain't going to happen. Tends to summarize out fairly well. And so what we do Planet Mark-wise in terms of turning that kind of into action is we have a 3-pillar process that starts with measure, and helps people understand their baselines, like where are you now? What's the sort of the lay of the land? Then we have engage, and engage is where you then look to engage as many stakeholders as you can or as you need to. The staff, the teams within the business and the organization, the suppliers, the investors, the customers, like who are your different stakeholder groups, and how are you going to engage each of those on this subject? And engage with them. And so our engagement team move in with our members to try and sort of really help them get to grips with things, get them excited about it. So like, okay, here's your carbon footprint. What does this mean? What's the significance for your role in the business? And what could you do to start helping reduce your company's emissions in the coming year? So really leaning into that engagement piece. And then the third one, so you've got measure, engage. Third is communicate. And this is really important because this is actually where a lot of the impact can come from, is really through influencing others and influencing and inspiring others and helping them get to grips with things. Where if you can communicate what's worked really well for you, but also what hasn't worked well at all, like what are your big learnings, the ones where it's like, oh, that didn't go as expected. If you share those really transparently and authentically, then you can help accelerate other people along their journey. And that's super, super important because, I love the metaphor of the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which is the biggest campaign to set net zero targets for companies. And the metaphor of the Race to Zero is all like, this is a race. And there are going to be winners and losers in this race. There will be companies that do very well because they take it seriously and they really lean into it. And there'll be those who fall behind because they don't and they get caught out. But most critically of all, this is a race that we will all win or we will all lose together. And so it's not about who's first across the line. It's about who's last across the line and when they're last across the line. And so it's very much in our interest to try and sort of bring people with us on this journey, our employees, our suppliers, our customers, bring them with us on the journey and help accelerate them on their own journeys through our own learnings. Because by doing that, we will enable us all, hopefully, to win this race to zero and achieve net zero within a time frame that limits the negative impacts of the climate crisis upon humanity.
Yeah, really interesting point. We're all in the same race, aren't we?
We're in the same boat. I think another really nice metaphor is that if you're in a boat and it's got loads of holes in it and it's leaking and actively taking on water, and you've invented the patch kit to patch up the holes in the boat, don't hold that back and hide it from everyone else and trademark it and be like, no, this is my competitive advantage. I've invented the patch kit. If the boat sinks, you're still on the boat. like for crying out loud, share the patch kit. Get as many different people patching the holes in the boat as possible, because you might benefit for a short period of time where you can charge crazy margins for your wonderful patch kit that you've invented. But if the boat still sinks, you're still on the boat. So it's much better for you to disseminate that information as transparently and as widely as possible, because ultimately it is in your own interest as well.
I think that's a valid point, even just around communication from customer relationships perspective, in terms of maybe not perhaps being the most sustainable business, but with the intention of doing so in a very honest way, in an attempt to build trust, as opposed to greenwashing and saying, well, with all the claims in the world that can't be backed up in terms of how sustainable a business is.
Yeah, I think what my advice to people generally on the greenwashing front is make sure that whenever you're sort of communicating, particularly a milestone of progress on your sustainability journey, present it as a journey. I think where people fall into trouble is when they present something as if they have finished. It's like, we are carbon neutral, full stop. We have, this our product is good for the planet. And so there's sort of two challenges that come up. Either you're being vague and you're not really giving a very clear statement that's not backed by any evidence and you sort of can't say it, or you're presenting it as if you're done. And so I think there are a number of things you can do. Well, first of all, I'd recommend looking up the Green Claims Code in the UK, but it's worth looking at from wherever you are in the world if there's not one that is sort of similar for your country. But the Advertising Standards Agency in the UK has created a sort of a green claims code sort of methodology where you can go literally onto a website and you can make your way through a list of questions, which are framed as yes/no questions. Does your claim meet these criteria? Have you shared all of the information? Have you, all these different sort of things? And if you can't answer yes to every question, it's probably not a good idea to make the claim. So it sort of really sort of simplifies it. But the critical thing is making sure that you are the information that someone would need to look further is available, readily available. It doesn't have to be on the product or on the thing, but they've got to be able to find it easily. But then, and sort of making sure that, you're backing up claims that you're making. And then the second thing is presenting it as a journey. So good example of this, as one of the law firms, Planet Mark Certified. This is actually before I joined Planet Mark about 5 years ago. I went to an event that Planet Mark hosted at this law firm, and the law firm sort of stood up and said, we're delighted that we have achieved reductions this year. When we've reduced our carbon footprint by X amount. And it would have been very easy for them to stop there and just celebrate, just do the celebration. But instead they went, but one of the things we noticed within our footprint is that actually our business travel increased. And we have quite a lot of international clients. And so in the coming year, the thing we really want to focus on is tackling our business travel emissions. And we want to try and find ways of bringing that down. And straight away, everyone in the room, they pointed to their own Achilles heel, right? They said, we're really pleased we've made progress, but we're not done yet. The next thing that we're going to be working on is this. And that framing means that everyone in the room was with them. Everyone in the room was going, this is, well done on achieving the absolute reductions overall, but they got so much more credit, ironically, for having been transparent about where they had a problem than they would have done if they just presented their win. And so really presenting it as a journey for people, I think, is helpful, where if you can point to your own Achilles heel, it's very hard for anyone to sort of also point at your Achilles heel with any amount of sort of vitriol. They can't you've taken away the sting because you've gone, well, yeah, we acknowledge that. That's something we want to work on now. And as long as you're genuine and you are actually going to work on it, then that sort of tends to play very well.
Yeah, that's great, and a great example. What trends are you seeing in the sustainability space? Any kind of success stories, or what's the next big thing that companies are looking at from a sustainable perspective?
Yeah, so I think we're definitely transitioning from people talking a lot about targets to caring a lot more about demonstrations of progress and action. There was a bit of a flurry of activity around net zero, where it was like, everyone's setting net zero targets. Well, I've got this target, I've got that target, I'm doing this target, 2030, 2035, 2025, all of these different targets sort of coming out in a flurry. That's good. But one of the big things about particularly carbon, and sustainability is about much more than carbon. It's about environment, social, and governance, and everything that sort of encompasses. But to sort of zero in on carbon a little bit, it's the way that carbon emissions work. Your suppliers' emissions are your emissions, the part of their emissions that you're responsible for. So when you buy a product or a service from a company, their emissions are your emissions that are associated with that product or service. Similarly, for your customers, your carbon footprint is their carbon footprint. And it kind of nests all the way down. This is what Scope 3 emissions are, where the value chain emissions looks at, okay, what are the emissions that are kind of nested within the products and services that you're buying and using to fulfill your own services. And what that means is targets really, if you're working for a really big brand, let's say that you are a supplier to a really the biggest company in your sector or your sort of industry, and they have regulations and stuff being applied to them, and they want to go on their state. They have a net zero target. Guaranteed 85 to 99% of their carbon footprint will sit in Scope 3 value chain emissions. That's where it'll sit. The biggest chunk of their footprint sits there. So how do they reduce their carbon footprint? By turning to you and asking you to reduce yours. So for many organizations, if you haven't already had an email from your biggest customer asking you for your carbon footprint, your targets, and your action plan and sort of how you're making progress against those targets, within the next 12 to 18 months, you will receive that email. And they often don't give you very long to do it. That was sort of one of the biggest supermarket chains in the UK, Tesco, back in September 2021, 2 years ago, sent out an email to all of their suppliers saying, we need your carbon footprint within the next, it was basically by the end of the year, which was 3 months notice. Thanks for that. We need you to have a net zero target by the end of 2022. It needs to be a science-based target by the end of 2023. And we need you to switch to renewable energy if you haven't done so already. And so if you haven't received that email from one of your biggest customers yet, you're going to, because of the way in which it influences your carbon footprint is their carbon footprint. It doesn't matter how big you are as a business. If you have, and it doesn't even matter if you're not their direct customer. If you work for someone who works for someone who works for someone who is that very big customer who's falling under some of the regulations that are emerging, particularly in the EU and the UK, then, they are coming for your data.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I don't think many businesses are even aware of it, particularly service-based businesses.
It's catching a lot of people by surprise and catching them unawares. And it's something that we're engaging very proactively with governments about to say, look, because the regulators think, the way the regulators are acting, they're like, oh, well, SMEs aren't in the scope. Small and medium-sized businesses aren't in the scope of our regulation. They're not included. And you're going, yes, they are, though. They are indirectly implicated because the regulations that you're placing onto the very large businesses involve gathering supply chain emissions data. And that's good. That's right. That absolutely is what we should be doing. But they need to more specifically reference SMEs within it and either set out a clear timeline. My idea would be for them to set a very clear timeline to say, by 2027 or 2028 or 2030, whatever it is, all organizations of all shapes and sizes will need to measure scope 1 and 2 emissions, which for most organizations is utility bills and vehicles if you own any. That's it. For most majority of businesses, that's what that will involve measuring, which is data you already have because you capture it for your finances. So if just you've already got that data, it's not a problem. So if we can set out that timeline so everyone knows that it's coming, then big businesses can plan their strategies on how they're going to get data out the supply chains around that. But at the moment, the large corporates are being left to come up with their own carrots and sticks to drag information out their supply chain, and often finding it very, very hard to do so. And so we need policy really needs to solve that gap, but also they need to put some provisions in. And the EU's done a slightly better job at this of putting in provisions that specifically protect SMEs to say what is reasonable to ask a very small business in a supply chain to do and what is not reasonable, to make sure that they don't start getting sort of unfairly sort of discriminated against to a certain degree because there are mandatory provisions being put in place that would cost them, tens of thousands of pounds of money and or resource to actually access in terms of, reporting, disclosure, legislative compliance or things like that.
And so you're saying that in the UK, it's not as well protected as in the EU?
I would say not at the moment. The regulations that we have, the requirements coming into effect in the EU are growing. They're getting more stringent in a very positive way. I think the EU's, at the moment, as far as I'm aware, the EU is doing the best job legislatively. The US is going to be chasing hard on their heels because there are some rules that the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, are planning on bringing in within the US that's meant to be announced this year, but we've yet to see them. So we'll see. Well, they're out for public consultation, but we yet to see what the final position will end up being. But the EU generally is doing a pretty good job with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, that's coming into effect over the next sort of 12, 18 months. But then following hot on its heels is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, which is all about supply chains. It's about due diligence within supply chains and also looking at directors' fiduciary responsibilities and how what was the responsibility of the board and of directors within businesses to know this stuff and to make decisions using data that informs them on this stuff.
Interesting. Very interesting few years coming, I think.
It's going to be, it is going to be interesting because it's when you talk to any policymaker, they're very clear now that at some point all organizations will have to measure this, and that they largely see particularly carbon data as being the same as financial data. And one of them put it really succinctly to me, where he said, this is someone from the European Commission, and they said, well, we see carbon data as the same as financial data. And what that means to us is at some point, every organization will have to report this data. Number two, that data will need to be audited to some level. And number three, manipulation or distortion of that data will be considered fraud. And so, at the moment we're stepping in within anyone who is in the EU or trades with the EU is coming under what is called sort of limited assurance, which is the audit requirements associated with that data, where there's limited assurance required, where a competent third party needs to check and verify certain pieces of the data, whether that be the emissions data itself or the plans or the targets that are being set by the organization have to be audited by a competent third party. By 2027, 2028 was when they anticipated a step up to reasonable assurance, which puts carbon data on par with financial data in terms of the level of auditing required at that stage. So yeah, it's something that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
I don't mean to overwhelm people, but yeah, if you've got questions, come and ask. That's what we're here for.
Yes, and wherever you're watching, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, I think LinkedIn's probably the best place to find you. Is that correct, Andrew?
Yeah, that's. I don't really use any other form of social media these days. LinkedIn's my jam. It's my jam.
Yep, absolutely. A question I want to fit. Well, let's not be all doom and gloom. But a question I wanted to finish on, because I know we could talk forever, but to keep these interviews at a a good 30 to 40 minutes, I wanted to ask you. You have a fantastic TEDx talk, Andrew, on networking, and you and I know each other through LinkedIn Local and have co-created an enormous amount of content and ideas and everything else. But I wanted to ask you, how important is networking and co-creation in the sustainability space?
Hugely. Full stop. No. So hugely is the short answer. The longer answer is so sustainability is a massively growing space, right? It's a growth market, I think it's safe to say. And it's still a bit of a small world in many ways, where I regularly cross paths with the same people at different events and at different spaces and things. So it's a bit of a small world, but also it's a rapidly growing world. And I think I'll sort of think of in a few ways. The first is a broad general level, which I think is true of all networking, meaningful networking, I'll say. I think meaningful networking, i.e. not running around a room and shoving pieces of paper into as many people's hands as possible, by just distributing business cards like they're dollar bills, that doesn't, you're playing a numbers game, doesn't work. Like, it doesn't work well. Like you might do all right out of it in certain limited professions, but generally you're not really going to do nearly as well as someone who is approaching it from a stance of sort of wanting to engage meaningfully and to add value into the conversations they've got and show a genuine interest in the human being that is in front of them, which is something that I massively learned through our involvement together in LinkedIn Local, which Anna, of course, championed and set up and founded from the outset. So I've gained a huge amount from the LinkedIn Local community, to which is very much to Anna's credit. But so at a broad level, in any space, I think meaningful networking benefits from the miracle of compound interest. And what I mean by that is, like, when we, leave university or first get into the world of work, we're told, you must invest in your pension. The earlier you begin investing in your pension, the miracle of compound interest means that the more time you're investing, the more that you will have at the end of it, the more value you will create and generate because of this miracle of the compounding effects over time. And I think that the same is true of meaningful networking. And not just in a sort of a crude financial sense, although that absolutely is and can be true too, but in the value that you create, in the friendships that you form, in the things that you learn through people in the network that exists, where I find it remarkable these days where, our mutual friend, Alexandra Galvez, who was another one of the co-founders of LinkedIn Local, I remember us doing LinkedIn Local events, and it being quite a lot of effort sometimes to get people to come, where you'd be hustling to sort of, you'd be posting really regularly, you'd be sending people messages, oh, you should come to this event, trying to get people to come along. And now it's just surreal how straightforward it becomes, where I think we each posted about it maybe once or twice. We sent out emails to mailing lists. And because there is a reputation that now has emerged of what these events mean, of what they do, and people like them, they get, they sort of have a positive affiliation and affinity to them. We sold out with over 230 registrations, just sort of like more than a week in advance, and we didn't even try it. And that for me is and people are like, oh, how is this so easy for you to organize? It's like, it wasn't, trust me, it wasn't always like this, but we have been doing this for a long time, and it's had a compounding effect where now, if I need to, and this is sort of the second reflection, is the learning potential, where I get a lot of credit for knowing more. I think people think I know more than I do. Very regularly, I get a lot more credit than I deserve for what I know off the top of my head. Really, the real superpower is not knowing loads and loads of stuff. The real superpower is I know who to ask if I need to know something. So if I have an event coming up and I need to deep dive on, so I've been asked to do a panel and it's going to be about product sustainability, or it's going to be about event sustainability, or it's going to be about packaging sustainability. I am not the authority on any of those subjects by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know some people who I can pick the brains of very quickly to gather the most pertinent points of information and then frame that information back in a way that hopefully will be useful to others who might be coming from a sort of a lower baseline of knowledge or understanding, to summarize an issue well. It's that whole thing about it's not what you know, it's who you know, is absolutely true, but not in a sort of Machiavellian sense, very much in the value that you can bring to others and the value that others bring to you in this sort of magnificent circle of adding value. And if you engage in that in an open way, in a proactive way, and in a way where you're genuinely wanting to contribute and bring something to it, it accelerates and accelerates and accelerates and accelerates and gets to the point where it just becomes a little bit ridiculous. And I sort of have to pinch myself regularly when it's like, someone, can we want to talk to someone at this company? I'm like, oh yeah, I think I met someone. I'm connected to someone that I can reach out. They're like, well, how do you know all these people? It's like, what? No is a very strong word, but we've met, we've connected, and I remember the engagement, the interaction we had, and I have a place to start a conversation from, so that's not hugely transactional. It's much more about the interaction and about the relationships that you form. Anyway, that's the long-winded answer to hugely.
And it's a very good long-winded answer. Andrew, thank you so much. This has been a really insightful conversation. If you're watching the replay and you do have questions, please do pop them in the comments. Andrew and I can pick them up and get back to you. And any questions specifically, if you are, I think, in the UK, probably, and have some questions around sustainability, Andrew might be a good person to connect with to get some answers to perhaps some things that in your business that you may need to address.
Excellent. Well, it's lovely to be here, Anna, and thank you for inviting me along. And we need to have a proper catch up now, don't we?
We do. Thank you, everyone. And I look forward to 2 more conversations before World Values Day. But don't forget World Values Day. Do check in on the website, on the page. Do share your values selfies. We are looking forward to those throughout the whole of October. We're almost here. So thanks again, Andrew. And thanks, everyone, for watching. And we'll see you soon.
See you soon. Thanks, everyone.